Shalom, Chavarim. Welcome to the Jewish Road Podcast. We are here to help Christians make sense of their roots so they can help the Jewish people make sense of Jesus. My name is Matt, and I'm here with that other guy over there.
Yeah, I'm the other guy. Hi, I'm Ron, and shalom to y'all. Or I should say, hi, y'all.
Is that what you were practicing over there?
That's what we do now in Kentucky. Hi, y'all.
Wow.
It's a little Jewish play on words.
It's a fantastic Jewish play on words. I'm sure the people really appreciate it.
Yeah.
What are we here to do? Why are we doing a podcast?
Well, we're doing a podcast. I think we're doing a podcast to, like you said when we opened up, to help Christians make sense of their roots so they can help Jews make sense out of Jesus.
Yeah, and so we are doing this from a unique perspective. We are both Messianic Jews, which means that we ethnically are Jewish people. We come from a long line of, in fact, my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was Abraham, right?
Right.
But we're also distinctive and unique because we happen to also believe in Jesus. And
there's a few of us, a remnant.
Yeah. In fact, what's the current statistic out there right now?
About 1%.
1%. So of all of the Jewish people in the world, 1% of us, of the Jewish people, actually believe in Jesus, and the rest say he's not for us.
Not for us. I think when I became a believer, it was half of 1%.
Wow. So we're growing.
Yeah.
We're making some headway. And that's why we're doing the podcast, right? Maybe we'll get another 0.5% by the time this is all done.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're here to share the whole story, and we are plunging our way through the story of Passover, and we've been really just hitting it from the Act 1 perspective, and we are, in the upcoming episodes here, going to be tracing our way over into Act 2, and all of this has some really great implications for us, especially coming up in this season. But like in every podcast, we have to have just a little bit of humor because we like to laugh and have some fun, right?
Yeah, it's just a part of our makeup. We got to do it.
Yeah, so we laugh a lot. So here, I believe you have something going on over there. I see you preparing.
Okay, well, this is kind of an interesting story since we're in Passover. This is a story about a little boy who came home from Hebrew school, and his father asked him, "What did you learn today?" And he answers, "Well, the rabbi told us how Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt." And the father says, "Yeah, how? How did he say? What did he tell you?" And the boy says, "Well, Moses was a big, strong man, and he beat Pharaoh up. Oh. And then while Pharaoh was down, he got all the people together and ran towards the sea. And when they got there at the sea, he had a Army Corps of Engineers build a huge pontoon bridge."
Wait. I think we've diverted from the script a little bit, right?
It might be, but this is the story. This is what he's telling his dad.
All right.
So they built a big pontoon bridge.
Yeah.
And once they got out onto the other side, all the Jewish people got across on the bridge. Then they blew up the bridge while the Egyptians were trying to cross. And so father looks at him and he's kind of shocked and he says, "Is that what the rabbi taught you?" And the boy says, "No, but you'd never believe the story that he did tell us."
That's good.
Inflict ourselves with a little Jewish humor.
Oh, boy. All right. Well, here we go. Let's get into it. We're going to take on a little section here known as the 10 Plagues. Growing up in a Jewish household, we had a lot of fun with it. This was the part that felt like you could introduce it to the kids, and even though it's a total pandemic in this entire countryside, it's hitting the Egyptians, it's hitting the Israelites. That this is the one part I remember. Like we would say frogs, and we'd have like all of these little miniature toy frogs. You'd get like 100 for a couple bucks at the little dollar store, and we'd throw the frogs and we'd say frogs, and everybody would run away. And I know some families they would get dye water red, and they would throw this red and they say blood all over the place.
Awful.
It's like a very kind of kiddie part, but there's something actually very heavy and very serious about the whole thing.
Yeah, it's a little more serious than we did when, we were first new believers back in those days, and as you guys were growing up. But, there's a serious part to the whole thing, too.
Yeah, and there is a purpose to all of this. And we're not going to dig deep into all of them, but we do want to just kind of touch on some of these because there is a story behind some of these. And as you're looking at this, maybe just a way of setting this up a little bit is that God is a God who has brought, in the creation narrative, in the very beginning in Genesis, he takes chaos and he brings it to order. And in a sense, as you look through these 10 plagues, we are undoing that creation. We are going from order and moving backwards into chaos. And you see some of these things that are being laid out. And so we want to walk through some of those.
Yeah, it's interesting that the God who created out of absolutely nothing can also uncreate according to however it serves his purpose.
Yeah, and not only can he uncreate or allow that chaos to be, but then also put it back together. You know, I don't know if I've tried to fix something in the past, I could always tear something apart, but it was always the putting back together that I was like, where did that part go?
Yeah, you don't need any instructions to tear it apart.
Yeah. So one thing we want to really hit upon is that God has a purpose in all of this. And as you look through Exodus chapter 7, for example, it says, I will lay my hands upon Egypt and deliver hosts, my people, the Israelites, from the land of Egypt with great acts of judgment. And verse 5, and the Egyptians shall know that I am God when I stretch out my hand against Egypt.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and one of the things to really key on in that is and throughout is that God makes a distinction between the Egyptians and between his people Israel. And here he uses a possessive noun and he refers to them as my hosts, my people. You know, and the nation is seen as being organized like an army. And when he talks about his people, he uses the possessive pronoun and he creates kind of this an incongruity that is between Pharaoh acting as if the people are his people when they're really God's people.
Yeah. And so even though you have the Israelites and you have the Egyptians, they're all looking there. And certainly the Egyptians are learning a lesson. And many of them, by the end of it, they had really joined the ranks of the Israelites and went out in a mixed multitude out with the Israelites and into the wilderness. The true beneficiaries of the lesson in all of this, God is teaching the Israelites. Right. And you can, if you fast forward all the way to the end of the story in Exodus 14, it says, when Israel saw the mighty act, literally it means the hand or the arm of God, which the Lord had done in Egypt, the people feared the Lord and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses.
They come through all of these horrific things, and in every single one of them, God is creating that distinction between Israel and Egypt, and Israel is protected through these things, and they come out as a people believing in God, and even some of the Egyptians end up believing in God, and that's part of the reason God is doing it also, is he's showing Egypt that he is the only God, since they had so many of them.
Yeah. Well, let's start at the first plague. The first plague is the Nile turning to blood, and as you look at this story, the Nile is life for Egypt, and there is this picture of what happens. And before the Nile turns to blood, the Nile is life for everybody. But if you go back to the beginning of the story, in the beginning of Exodus, what's happening in the Nile?
Well, what is happening? It's happening for a reason. And the reason is there was a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, and he became a little paranoid over how Israel was multiplying so fast and the Jews were multiplying so fast, and he was afraid that they were going to take over if they got to be too many of them. So he begins to oppress Israel, and he hands out a decree that the male children will be drowned in the Nile.
Yeah, firstborn male.
Male.
And this is we've talked about the dichotomy between empire and kingdom. Whenever the empire is threatened, they always use fear to get control.
Yeah.
Right? We need to control this situation.
Boy, does that sound familiar, huh?
Yeah. So, I mean, you fast forward, you go to Act 2, and Jesus is born in this little town called Bethlehem, and there's another ruler of an empire.
Yeah.
But this time it's not Egypt and Pharaoh, it's
Herod.
Herod and Rome.
In Rome.
Right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's prophecy that says that there is a new king that will be born.
Yeah.
Well, so it's a population control here back in Exodus, and so we need to get rid of all. There's too many of these boys, which actually is not really all that smart if you're trying to. Well, on one side, you're killing some of your labor force, but the other side is you don't want to raise up a next generation of strong men who might be able to overthrow you.
Yeah.
Now, this is a community. Think about this. Egypt, they're coming by force and they're ripping these babies out of their mother's arms.
Yeah.
And these mothers are trying to hide their babies and keep them safe.
Yeah.
And there shows up here in Exodus 2, there's a mother. She conceived, she bore a son. And when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months.
Just an infant at that time, and he got to a point where she couldn't hide him anymore, and she made a basket for him out of the bulrushes, and it says in the scripture that she daubed it with bitumen and pitch.
What
I guess that's
translation do you
tar.
have going
That's
on over
tar
there?
and pitch.
My goodness, is that King James? Or is that the Amplified Bible? What are you reading over there?
This is an ESV.
Wow, it doesn't even sound like it. It's
It's
crazy.
usually pretty good.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
a rough
let me
one.
let me read it in real English.
Yeah,
It says
put
this. When she could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket and covered it over with tar and pitch.
Yeah.
And she put the child into it, set him among the reeds in the Nile. And it's interesting because we don't see these words tar and pitch for a while, but they actually, the first time they show up, and this is a really good kind of hermeneutic tool, if you see some words that maybe stand out, what's the first time that they're mentioned in the story?
Yeah, well, we saw them way back when, in the days of Noah, when he was building the ark.
Yeah, and so he has the ark, and really we've talked about this a little bit before too. The ark is etz, right? He takes a
Right.
tree and he makes out of the gopher etz, out of the
Right?
gopher
Etz
tree.
is the Hebrew word for tree.
Yeah, and so Noah takes his family, he takes this etz and he covers it with tar and pitch, and they go out upon the waters of death, and they are saved in this etz,
In the Etz.
in the tree. The tree saves.
Yeah.
And now you fast forward here, and there's another etz. It's a smaller etz. It doesn't fit all the animals. It just fits 3-month-old baby Moses.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's upon the waters of death, the Nile waters of death once again.
Right.
Now, this is where the Nile almost takes on this almost a anthropomorphic human form, where the Nile is conspiring in a sense with Egypt. You throw a baby into the Nile, and that baby's not going to be able to swim. The baby drowns, and the blood is covered. I mean, really, there's a current, and those babies, they're downstream. You don't see them anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's really no blood involved in the drowning of the babies, and they're silenced.
And so even in that silence, I think God shows up, especially in this first plague. And I think this is an empathetic move on God's part, that he sees, he knows, he hears the cries, even the silent cries of his people, the cries of the mothers, the cries of the babies. And isn't it interesting that here in that first plague, in this reversal, that God is taking that, and now the Nile, the sins have caught up, and the Nile can no longer hold back the blood of the innocents that were killed in it.
Actually, what you're getting at is the fact that God, in the first plague, turns the Nile River into blood.
Yeah.
And, it's interesting, even though I said that when the baby drowns, he's not bleeding, and yet God will tell us later in Leviticus that the life of the flesh is in the blood.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think there's a certain significance to that, because if you go back and recall Cain and Abel, when Cain killed his brother Abel, God said, "His blood is crying out to me from the ground."
Ooh,
And now,
that's good.
all of these babies being thrown into the Nile River, God is in essence, when he turns that river to blood, is saying in the same kind of a way that their blood is crying out. He gives a vivid illustration of it.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
That's good. You're holding out. You didn't tell me that before.
Yeah, well, I don't know. It's the stuff that just floats around in my head.
All right, so that's the first plague. I want to really quickly just run through the rest of the plagues. And as we do that, I want you to see that there's a connection. As God, the creator in Genesis, has created everything and he's brought chaos to order, there's an undoing of all of that. And you take even the next few plagues, right? You have frogs. Frogs are supposed to be in the water. They're supposed to stay in the water. That's where they like to hang out. And now they're coming out of the water. And so you have, like in Genesis 1:20, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, right? So you have that. It's the frogs, they're living in such a way that is incongruent with how they are naturally designed. And then you have the lice, and the lice, they come from the clumped earth, right? And so you look at this and you see that the lice is coming through and they are attacking and they're going through. You look at the flies in the fourth one, and you have the swarms of insects. In Genesis 1:22, it says that there are flying creatures that multiply on the land. But in Egypt, the flies, they not only multiply in the land, they fill the land. And we have these. God wants us to be able to fill the land, and there's going to be the reproduction. But finally, in Genesis 1:28 says, God tells the people to rule the fish of the sea, the winged creatures of the heavens, and all creatures which creep on the earth. In Egypt, these creatures are totally out of control. They are the ones ruling the humans, not the other way around.
Yeah, and this is something that God has done in His sovereign will and in His providence to bring things to His appointed ends here, which are to get His people now out of Egypt and into the land that He promised. Each of these things that you mentioned is actually a god of Egypt. The frogs, the gnats, they had a god for that. The flies, the god of Beelzebub, is the Egyptian god of flies. And so God is really bringing a judgment on all of the gods of Egypt.
Yeah, you go through and you see the pestilence, and that's the next one. And you look in Genesis 2, the animals, they're created specifically for man, and now they're being removed. You can look at the hail and the locust. There's destruction of another part of creation, right? You have locusts. We even have locusts that comes through today, and they'll go through like these places in Africa, and they destroy the vegetation. Whereas you look in the Genesis account, once again, the land is bringing forth vegetation and seed-bearing fruit with it. And then you get to darkness in the ninth plague, and it's one of these, it's just kind of out of the blue, right? What's happening?
That's a way
there?
of putting it.
Oh, out of the blue. Yeah, it is. Yeah, we go from blue to black, right?
Yeah.
In 10:23, the people could not see each other, and for 3 days no one could get up from where they were. It's a deafening, a blinding blindness, right, of all the black.
Yeah, is just a darkness. And what is really interesting about that is that the scripture talks about the fact that this happened to the Egyptians, but it didn't happen to the children of Israel. So there is just a pinpoint dividing line, I think, between Israel and where they are in Goshen and where the Egyptians are, and it's like a line that divides pitch black dark with light. And you say to yourself, how can that be? You know, even when the sun goes down, it goes down to dusk and to twilight, and then finally it gets dark. There wasn't any of that gray area in between. It was just strictly black on one side and white on the other side, if I can put it that way. You know, and this, again, is a judgment against a god that the Egyptians had. This is Ra, R-A, the sun god. So again, this is a judgment against the Egyptian gods. And what is interesting is Israel has now been in Egypt now as slaves. They haven't been free. They haven't been, really, they've probably been detached from their religion, and all they have of it is what they have heard, and if anything has been passed down from generation to generation in that bondage. They may be waiting for God to deliver them, but the only thing that they saw all around them were so many of the false gods of Egypt. And so in doing this, God is having to establish himself as the God, the one and only, the true and living God, against all of the false gods of Egypt, so that he can save his people out of that Egyptian bondage. And even, as the scripture shows, in many places, I think there's 8 places in just a couple of chapters in Exodus, where the Egyptians saw what was going on, and they believed that it was the God of Israel who was doing these things.
Well, and you come from a polytheistic culture, and the sense was that when all of these things are happening, you're thinking, oh, the gods must be fighting. We have to appease this God because this God is upset. And so you have these gods. It was never this thought that there could possibly be just one God who had control over all of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mentioned the sun god Ra, but there was also the god of the setting sun, which is Etum, and those two might have been fighting with each other, like you say.
Right. But what really happens, and this is, again, the undoing of the creation narrative. I mean, look, Genesis 1:3. Then God, monotheistic, the one God, said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. Right there in the very beginning, God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning one day. There was a sequence to it. God broke it up. Right here, you have the darkness and the light, but there's a wall between them, essentially.
Right.
So God is undoing this natural order. And then the other thing is that he could take that and then he can restore it back to its original creation.
Right. And what you're saying is when there's this strict line between darkness and light, it's not like we think of darkness and light like Pacific time and East Coast time. There's a line that goes right down the middle.
And essentially, too, it should be faith-building for us. If that same God can undo the plagues and bring things that were in chaos back to order, we know that creation even today, under the curse of sin, is groaning, that one day there will be a restoration of all things. So that gives us some hope in some of that.
Yeah.
And then finally, we get to the death of the firstborn. That's the 10th and the last plague. And this is really the big one. This is the one that is the game changer for everything. And this is really, it's an undoing of Genesis 1:26, right? We will make man in our image after our likeness. You have the creation of humans, and now man is essentially being destroyed. The firstborn male, who were not covered under the blood, they were cut off. They were killed.
And this, again, is a judgment and an attack against the Egyptian gods. They had several gods that were givers of life. For example, Osiris was one. So God is he is going after the gods of Egypt to show himself as the one true God.
Now, as we look at all of this, you look and you get to the end of the narrative in Exodus, and Israel looks back over the stilled water of the sea at a land with no people. There's no animals, no vegetation. There's a land in which creation had really been undone. In the end of this, Israel becomes convinced that God is the Lord over all creation. This even sets up this narrative that takes place in Act 2. Right? Jesus shows up. One of the first recorded miracles we get is in John. But even before we get to John, towards the end of all of this, remember in Exodus 14, we were looking at that. Is that where you were going there? At the very end of Exodus, verse, where am I?
Looking at about verse 30. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore.
It keeps going. And so, when they saw the power which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and his servant Moses.
Yeah. And these were miraculous things that God did, but it's interesting that you brought up in John, in the 2nd chapter, you have Yeshua, Jesus, at the marriage feast at Cana. And it's the miracle where he turns the water into wine. And that in itself was a miracle. It says that it was the first of his miracles. And in John chapter 2 and verse 11, it says the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, I think God was manifesting his glory back in Exodus as well.
Yeah.
Yeshua was doing it in a way seems a little anticlimactic against the Red Sea, but nevertheless, it was the first of his signs. He was going to do many others, and his disciples, it says, believed in him. And the reality of the whole thing is that the miracles were not just displays of God's power, but they were representative of a significance that went beyond the mere acts themselves and required the faith of those who saw. And this is what was taking place with the disciples. This was the goal of what God was doing in Egypt. We don't believe just because we saw the miracles themselves, but because who was behind the miracles.
Yeah, I'm just thinking through like all of the second act, the New Testament miracles that are taking place. All of these things is God bringing restoration to things that are broken, right? We take the blind and the sick and the lame, and God gives them sight and they can walk again, right? It's where things have gone into chaos once again that God is bringing order. He's righting where in the places where sin has really destroyed. You go even to the boat, and we talked about this earlier. The disciples are on the boat, and once again, there's water that is running amok. There's chaos, right, on the sea.
They're in the middle of a storm.
Yeah,
it's overlapping the boat, and he's sleeping in the back.
Right, and it says that they're afraid, and then Jesus, who is God, he says, "Shalom, hush, be still."
To the wind, to the storm.
Right, to the storm. And it says they go from being afraid, I think Mark says this, goes from afraid to very afraid.
Very afraid. They're petrified. They're petrified because they all of a sudden realize who's in the boat with them.
Right. It is God. So all of these things that take place in Act 1, when Jesus comes on the scene in Act 2 and he's performing these miracles, those are the moments where they realize he's not just a man, that he's doing things that only God could have done and has done historically.
Yeah. We've been tracing this as we've been going through Exodus, and we're just giving another example here, a couple of examples out of the gospel accounts, and it's interesting that the important fact of the whole matter is that Yeshua, Jesus, is God. There's somebody who pretty famous guy. I think you probably know him, Dennis Prager. Love Dennis Prager. He's a great guy, great thinker. He's a fine human being as far as what I can see of him, and I've been listening to him for a long time. But it's very interesting. He loves Christians because he believes Christians really love him, and he'll enter into conversations about Jesus, and the interesting thing is that he would say that he has no problem with Jesus being the Messiah, but what he and Jewish people have a problem with is Jesus being God. And what we're trying to lay out here is the fact that the God of the Old Covenant, Act 1, that we call it, of this two-act play, is the same God who is in the New Covenant, Act 2, and he's doing the same things that he did right from the beginning.
Yeah, and speaking even of the Gospel of John, it's funny we brought up the water to wine, but it just hit me at the end of the story of John in chapter 20, verse 30. It says that there were many other signs, therefore, that Jesus also performed in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. I always wonder, what were they? What did he do?
The libraries of the world couldn't hold it all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But these have been written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name.
Yeah.
And that's really, that's the story. And you just jump back to Exodus chapter 14, and that is why they believed. The Israelites, they looked at all that had happened. They look at the desecrated landscape, the animals, the ground, the people, and they're saying,
God has finally come and visited us.
Yeah.
He heard our cry.
Joseph was right.
Yeah.
Let's go get Joseph. Let's get out of here.
Yeah.
Yeah. And interesting too, even just to kind of wrap up that idea of the 10 plagues. I always thought this was interesting. In the Genesis 1 account, as God is creating everything, 10 times God says, "Let there be." And there's a creation point, right? You have Genesis 1, verse 3, verse 6, verse 9, 11, 14, 20, 24, 26, 28, 29. 10 times God says, "Let there be," and God brings about creation. And here in Exodus, we have 10 times the undoing.
Undoing of the creation. Yeah. That's an interesting point.
Yeah. So as we're here, we wrap up in Exodus chapter 12, verse 12. God brought judgment on the gods of Egypt. And we look at our God, the one true God who is over all other gods of the world, all over the universe. As we look at this story, this is far more than kids and throwing the plagues around. We even have finger puppets as plagues.
Yeah.
But there's something real that's going on. God wants to make himself known, and he wants to be known as the deliverer of his people.
It's a serious thing.
I think we should wrap it up there.
Okay.
All right. Well, this has been the Jewish Road Podcast. Thanks for listening. We have some more to come. And guess what? We're finally going to get into the second act, and we're going to talk about what was going on when Jesus is sitting with his disciples and he's remembering this Exodus story with them at the very last Passover Seder. You may know it as the Last Supper. What was he talking about with his disciples, and what did he bring to light in that meal? We'll hit that next time on the Jewish Road Podcast. But for now, Sha'alu Shalom Yerushalayim. It means
Pray for the peace of Jerusalem, especially these days.
Shalom.